So let's go on to another question. Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, he was interviewed years later, and he was asked by the interviewer what he learned from that book years later. And he said some interesting things, but he said that people would come up to him and say, I think the reason why God allowed your son to die a terrible death by this rapid aging disease, because you would write this book and help so many people. And he said that he would be courteous to them and not start an argument, but he said that he doesn't need to serve a God who tortures children for some far-off benefit. So my question to you is, does God cause the torture of children and cause young girls to be sold into slavery and to be thrown into a sex trade and to be sometimes murdered? Is it God that's doing that, or is it God only allowing it? How does that work?
Yeah, we sometimes talk about the first causes and second causes, and God is the primary cause of everything. If he wasn't the primary cause of everything, then he wouldn't be God. He would be something less than the God of the Bible that we read about there. And so it can't be that he knows everything and has everything. But there's secondary causes as well. And these secondary causes are real causes. It's not that we're puppets on a string and that God is just like, that's the illustration of the stiff arm. And God doesn't make people do wicked things. He allows them to do those wicked things, and in that sense ordains it. And even you find in the book of Job itself, I think it's kind of strange that the whole idea of Satan coming into heaven, you wonder what is he doing there and whatnot. But I think it's partly a way of showing that God is somewhat distant from this decision about having bad things happen to Job. God doesn't actually do it. Satan wants to do it. And God allows Satan to do it. So there's a certain disconnect that the narrative brings out between God. And that, I think that way is of trying to illustrate that idea of God permitting things and not actively doing them to people.
Right. But Satan is God's creation, right?
Right.
There's not a duality.
Right.
And so you'd have to come to the conclusion that God commanded Satan to come into his presence. Otherwise, he'd have no right to be there.
Right.
So God allowed him, or actually commanded him to come into his presence, and then brings up something that Satan might not have known about, which is Job himself. Have you considered my servant Job?
Yeah.
I mean, was that a setup?
It can sound like Satan is doing the dirty work of God.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what it's meant to be taken. But there's this there's a removal of God from the evil, and yet there's a connection at the same time. That God is, that He has to come into His presence. Satan is, like I say, God's creation. He's on God's leash, and yet it's trying to show us that God doesn't make people do evil to other people. They choose to do that's the secondary cause. They choose to do that, and He knows that ahead of time. He's therefore planned it ahead of time, and He ordains whatsoever comes to pass. But yet, so our confession says, it doesn't make God the God of evil or the author of evil, or causes. They're not direct causes; they're indirect. And in that sense, removes God from the being the author and responsible for it. Somehow we are responsible for our choices, even though God is sovereign. And that's another one of those things we don't fully understand, like the problem of evil. We don't know how those two can fit together. Yeah. But the Bible reveals both of them clearly, and we're wise to listen to both of them. If we only listen to the sovereignty part, we'll become a fatalist. If we only listen to the responsibility part, we'll become a person who feels that God is on the sidelines and we're just basically running the show until God would come in sometime. And so both of them, we got to avoid both of those extremes and realize that God is there's no choices outside of the realm of His sovereignty, and yet those choices are real choices made not only in real time, in space and time, but they're made, and there's consequences for those, and the responsibility of those choices go to the people who have made them,
Okay.
which is us.